Hello everyone, and welcome to our next lecture on the various influences of Old English. I promise this lecture will not be like the previous one on grammar and syntax. Okay, so we are getting back into the intersection between language and culture in this lecture. I talked a bit in the introductory lecture about Celtic and Roman influences on the historical context of Old English. But in the next few minutes, I'll get into their linguistic influences and also spend some time talking about how Scandinavians and Christianity had an impact on the English language. So let's get started. The first group that we want to talk about are the Celts. Most historians believe, and they agree, that the linguistic influence the Celts had on Old English is small, especially compared to that of the Romans and the Scandinavians. Driven out to the edges of the country, Celts wouldn't have had much influence on a language they weren't in contact with. Those who stayed behind in small communities and adapted to Anglo-Saxon rule would have likely adopted the superstratum language or preferred language rather than speaking the substratum language or stigmatized language that faces pressure from a different language in the same area. The Celts who remained left their mark, though, on place names. The two best known examples of Celtic place names are London and the River Thames. Okay, so those are the Celts. The next group that we want to look at are the Romans. The Roman influence on Old English was a great deal more significant. There were several periods of Roman or Latin borrowing in Old English because there was regular contact with Romans or other peoples who were also influenced by Romans. In the introduction to Old English, I explained that when the Roman forces arrived to colonize Britain, they would set up towns as trading outposts. The Britons who adapted to Roman rule were few. So when the Romans withdrew in 410 CE, the number of Latin speakers remaining in Britain was a minority. Latin was used in official documents by the Roman government, of course, but archaeologists have found tile and pottery fragments bearing Latin graffiti as well. The later Roman influence on Old English came from the Catholic Church. And we're going to talk about that in a few slides. So after the Celts, after the Romans, there were the Scandinavians. The Scandinavian influence on Old English was significant and sustained. Let's remember first that the Anglo-Saxons came from northern Germany and southern Denmark. So culturally and anthropologically speaking, they have a lot in common with the Vikings who would invade their shores. The Anglo-Saxons, interestingly enough, called Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes Dene without distinction. They were all Danes to the newly settled English. These Danes' language, which had a major influence on Old English, was collectively referred to as Old Norse. The Scandinavians practiced pagan religions just like the earliest Anglo-Saxon settlers, but some of the Danes converted to Christianity. The Danes were really quite threatening to the English because they didn't just show up and build a house and start farming. No, they raided the monasteries, like the famous ones in Lindisfarne and Jarrow, for precious metals, jewels, expensive material goods, and people who could be kidnapped as slaves. In terms of Scandinavian vocabulary, the Scandinavians also had a powerful linguistic force. Okay, let's remember that Old Norse is a North Germanic dialect and English is a West Germanic dialect. The similarities between the two are such that speakers of those languages could understand each other with some patience and concentration. The similarities are also so close that it can be difficult to determine whether a word was originally Old English or borrowed from Old Norse. When the Danes were settled in northern England, they were in regular contact with English speakers, so there was a great deal of cultural and linguistic exchange. At this time, about 1,000 Scandinavian words entered the language, and this is a significant contribution to Old English, but Old Norse loanwords wouldn't start appearing in writing until the Middle English period. The most significant impact Old Norse had on English, much like the Celtic language, was in place names. Perhaps 1,500 place names in northern England bear Scandinavian affixes. Any town ending with by, like Whitby, Derby, and Rugby, uses the Scandinavian word for farm or town, and towns that end with thorp or Thorpe, like Althorpe, Bishopsthorpe, and Gawthorpe, uses the Scandinavian word for village. After the Scandinavians comes probably one of the biggest influences, and that's the Christians. Let's begin by establishing the general impacts of Christianity on Anglo-Saxon England. Okay? The single most important effect of Christianization on Anglo-Saxon culture, and thus all subsequent variations of English culture, was the adoption of an orthographic system designed for recording longer texts. Okay? Orthography, in linguistics terms, is a language's conventions of spelling and writing. So when we say Christianization gave Old English an orthographic system, we mean they introduced a formalized, standardized writing system that was better suited for writing long texts than runes were. Runes were eventually abandoned in favor of the Latin alphabet, which we talked about in a previous lecture, but not right away. Because of the introduction of the Latin alphabet, more historical events and literary creations were recorded. This is why, as the period goes on, we see more and more written works. The Christian influence came from two groups, the Irish monks and missionaries in the north, and the Roman monks and missionaries in the south. Looking back to the Anglo-Saxon invasion of England, these Germanic peoples were pagan. They continued their pagan practice until about 150 to 200 years later when they were converted. And let us remember that the Celts and Britons who lived on the island before the Anglo-Saxons had already been converted by the Romans, who were there centuries before. So when the Anglo-Saxons drove the Celts to the outlying areas of Britain, those already converted Celts took their religion with them. Christianity as a whole is largely responsible for innovations in Old English writing, but Irish monks were especially skillful and artistic in penmanship. Okay? Roman missionaries landed in southern England and worked their way northward. Roman Christianity seemed to carry a tone of authority and authenticity. After all, they were the ones who brought Christianity to the Irish, so they seemed to be the original representatives of the faith. There was significant conflict between the two forms of Christianity, and the Anglo-Saxons had to choose a branch with which to identify, but ultimately England sided with Roman Christianity at the Synod of Whitby in 664. The people who made this decision preferred Roman customs over Irish. For example, the way they chose the date to celebrate Easter and the custom of monks shaving their heads. Their alignment symbolizes or foretells, I suppose, the accord between the English church and the Catholicism of the continent. Another effect of Christianization upon England is that Latin loanwords would start to be incorporated in the language, and Latin texts or translations would be commissioned in England. Both Irish and Roman missionaries had this in common as they spread Christianity across England. Okay, so I'll summarize the 3 periods of Latin borrowing, and you see that down here. So the first period was when Germanic tribes encountered Roman merchants on the continent before they ever arrived in England. The second period was the Celtic period, when the Anglo-Saxons had limited linguistic contact with Romanized Celts who spoke Latin, and that is before the Anglo-Saxons, drove them out. The third period of Latin borrowing, then, is the Christian period. Which was the focus of this slide. Okay, if I want to make a recommendation, you don't have to do this. This is just if you want to watch something to get some more background. I actually would recommend the show Vikings on the History Channel. It's actually a really entertaining dramatization of the Viking raids and settlements of England from their perspective, of course. So if you're interested in the historical period, what's happening at this time, I would watch an episode or two. Just a hint, just a thought. You don't have to. It's not required. Just something extra. As always, if you have any questions, email me, call me, come find me, and have a great day.